Welcome to the Frequency Labyrinth. I am Adrienne McDonald, your host. This podcast is for you if you're done with surface level self-help and ready for something deeper and actually transformative. Around here, we work with ancient wisdom, human design, gene keys, and shamanic practices, not as knowledge to collect, but as tools to live by. This isn't about one size fits all. It's about learning to work with your energy, your design, and your life. This is about integration and embodiment. We go deep here with ancient wisdom, practical integration, so that you can develop ironclad self-trust. Let's get into it. Hello, beautiful humans, and welcome back to the Frequency Labyrinth. Today we are diving into the Taurus New Moon that perfects tomorrow, May 16th at 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time. I've been looking at this one for a while, and I've been looking forward to it. It's one of those lunation cycles that is deliciously complex, I think, because under this grounded Taurus moon, there's this enormous movement of energy that's happening psychologically and spiritually and emotionally and archetypally all at once. Now, I'm going to go through the human design gate and gene keys that this is going through. And then I'm going to move on to the rest of the cosmic mix that I feel like is going to make this really powerful. So the sun and moon are meeting in human design gate 8. And this is the gate of contribution. And this is where the gene keys move from the shadow of mediocrity into the gift of style and eventually into the acidic state of exquisiteness. And we have Mercury conjunct this new moon at Taurus, Uranus in Gemini squaring the nodes of the moon, Jupiter in Cancer offering some emotional expansion and nourishment, and the final Mars-Chiron activation in Aries is exposing some old wounds around authenticity and visibility, and then layered into all of this lunation is conjunct the fixed star Algol, which is one of the most interesting, I think, of the fixed stars in astrology, and it is also known as the head of Medusa, I believe. But it carries themes of projection and exile and fear and power, and it's also sometimes called the demon star. So it's pretty much what society doesn't know how to comfortably integrate. All right. So at the same time, we're also moving through Beltane on the Celtic wisdom wheel, where the wheel of the year turns southward into greater vitality and fertility and embodiment and creative expression and participation. So I know I said in the May cosmic energy forecast, most people in modern times celebrate Beltane on May 1st. As a Celtic shamanic practitioner, I tend to follow the lunar cycle. So that is why I follow it on the new moon. So I think that one of the reasons why this new moon feels so potent is because you have all these archetypal threads that are pointing towards this deeper question from different angles. And that question is, what happens when the soul level self can no longer comfortably remain underground? And this really doesn't feel like the, high vibes manifestation checklist kind of new moon. It feels like almost like an initiation. It feels like a threshold moon. It feels like one of those lunations where something that has been dormant or suppressed or edited or exiled or shape-shifted for survival reasons begins really pressing upon that surface and asking, it wants to reach the sunlight. It wants air again. And that can sound that can sound kind of beautiful in theory until authentic expression starts threatening things that we've built our lives around, our, approval, belonging, safety, predictability, relationships, professional identities, coping mechanisms, roles that we have unconsciously performed for years and sometimes decades. So let's slow this down and go through each piece. And because I think each layer of this cosmic picture has something to say, and together they sort of weave into a story of what's being asked of us. So let's start with human design gate that's activated by the sun and the moon at this new moon. All right, so gate 8 is the gate of contribution, like I said. And when it's moving through the Gene Keys framework, mediocrity, style, exquisiteness, mediocrity lands poorly for some people. They immediately hear it as an insult. We hear average or untalented or not trying hard enough. And the shadow of this gate is when someone disconnects from their own living signal, their own internal compass. That's what we really mean here, because they've spent so much time calibrating themselves around what's acceptable, what's rewarded, marketable, or safe. It's self-abandonment through conformity. It's a slow erosion of your actual expression under the accumulated weight of other people's expectations or cultural conditioning or fear of rejection. And the very real need, the human need to belong. And the insidious thing about the shadow is it doesn't always look like stagnation from the outside. Some people living deeply in this shadow frequency can appear incredibly productive, incredibly successful by external metrics, incredibly busy, but internally feel hollow in a way that's hard to explain. And you can really see this everywhere. People drowning in information while starving for meaning. People endlessly consuming self-help content while remaining fundamentally disconnected from their own signal. People who intellectually understand who they are but don't fully trust themselves enough to actually embody it in a way that's visible and real. And then wonder why life force starts to thin out underneath the performance, and why motivation keeps collapsing, and why satisfaction never quite arrives, even when things are going quote unquote well. And that's the thing about gate 8. It understands that the soul can't breathe fully inside a masked version of yourself indefinitely. There's a cost to suppressing what is genuinely you. And eventually, whether it's through crisis or a threshold moment or a lunation like this one, the authentic signal starts pressing through. Now, the gift of this frequency is style. And I think modern culture honestly completely flattens what that means, because we've reduced it to aesthetics and branding and image. But real style in the Gene Keys world is like energetic coherence. It's what naturally emerges when someone stops imitating and starts inhabiting themselves fully, when they stop managing their expression and start fully trusting it. And you can feel it when someone is speaking from lived experience rather than just bullshit recycled language. There's a texture to it. There's a presence to it. There's a weight to it. Something that moves through them rather than something that they're constructing for consumption. And at the city state, exquisiteness is where expression becomes something beyond performance entirely. It's something that, it approaches the sacred. It's something that can't be manufactured or optimized into existence. It sort of emerges on its own when someone is being genuinely inhabited by what's moving through them. And that's the invitation of this new moon. Not to become more impressive, not to optimize your brand, not to become more spiritually aesthetic. It's asking, what is my most true expression when we strip away all the BS, right? Now, I followed the lunar calendar for Beltane, as I said, which places the second new moon after the spring equinox, meaning this Taurus new moon. And I think that Beltane is interesting because it marked one of the fire festivals of the year. It was a turning point into the bright half, the outward half, the season of full life, return to the land. Fires were lit. Cattles were driven between two fires for purification and protection before being moved to summer pastures. And communities gathered not simply to celebrate, but to consciously participate with the return of vitality and fertility and life force. And there's ceremony here. There was intentionality here. There was an understanding that this threshold mattered and that how you crossed it set something in motion. And I think that there's something to be said about sitting with the aliveness of this. Yes, there was creative fire and the feeling of something finally released after turning inward over the winter time, but there was also, the fire was a purifier. And it was also, I think there was also an understanding that crossing a threshold genuinely and generally meant leaving something behind. You can't take everything with you into the next season. Something has to be composted. Something has to be surrendered at the fire before you walk through. And the South carries that expression as one of its primary qualities. How you communicate, how you create, how you bring something internal into the external world, how you connect, how you participate. It's the direction of the bold move, the unapologetic showing up, the willingness to let what's inside of you become visible, even when you are not sure how that's going to be taken out in the world. The color of the South that it's associated with the South is white, which I always find interesting because in the West, we associate the color white with purity and simplicity. But in this context, I believe it speaks more to clarity and full presence, just something seen in its essential nature without any disguise. The dove is also sometimes associated with this direction as like a messenger. The hare is life force moving rapidly into form. And so what I want you to hold as we move into this lunation cycle, that Beltane is not asking you to perform anything. It's not asking you to announce yourself or optimize your visibility strategy. It's acknowledging that you have something within you that wants to be expressed and feel alive again. Now, let's move into the rest of the cosmic mix. Mercury is conjunct this new moon, which I think is genuinely supportive because this lunation does have some edges to it. And Mercury in Taurus so does have a sort of a slow its roll type of thing. It can help the mind slow down enough to hear what's actually true underneath all the static, underneath the noise of the news cycle, productivity metrics, the endless optimization culture, the spiritual content telling you who you should be and how you should feel. It asks slower questions, heavier questions, questions with deeper roots. Not what should I be doing, but what am I actually building my life around? Not how do I optimize this, but maybe what does my nervous system actually need in order to soften instead of continuously brace? Not what is the next step, but maybe what have I been tolerating that no longer feels sustainable? And I think the invitation of Mercury here is, because it is in Taurus, and this is a Taurus lunation, is about values, not necessarily the values we say we have, but the values that are revealed by actually spending, like where are we spending our time, our attention, our energy, our money. Taurus is a sign of embodied values. It's what we have here on a more material plane. And Taurus doesn't really care what you believe in the abstract. It cares what you feed every single day in the small and larger choices of your actually life, in your actual life. And Mercury conjunct this new moon is asking you to get really honest about that gap, if one exists, between the life you're presenting and the life your nervous system is actually trying to live. So this is a moment for better questions to arrive, not really force clarity, but the kind of insight that comes when you finally slow down to hear yourself again. And we're just coming off of Mercury Gazimi, so we're still riding that wave. I feel like you probably got some inkling of this earlier, or probably around midweek. And so pay attention to what landed for you the latter half of this week as we go into this new moon. Now, this new moon is also conjunct Uranus, which is also squaring the nodes of the moon. And that's a much bigger conversation than just this new moon. And it's bringing something that's like a lightning bolt, a little bit destabilizing and activating, clarifying all at once. Uranus recently entered Gemini, and we're beginning to understand collectively, start to get some insight into what that's going to mean for us. A period where the mind becomes a little bit louder because Gemini is a Mercury-ruled sign. Information moves faster, narratives shift faster, synchronicities increase. In fact, over the next month, you might see a significant amount more of synchronicities happening. Downloads coming hot and fast. Something someone says in passing cracks open an entire awareness that you can't unknow afterwards. And because it's squaring the nodes, which represent the axis of the collective karma and the collective destiny, this lightning is touching something about the direction that we're all being asked to move personally, both personally and collectively. So this may show up like your body understands something before your mind can catch up. You may realize that something no longer fits, a relationship, a role, a belief you've organized your identity around, a way of living that you may have taken on from your parents rather than chose. And you might not be able to explain it rationally yet, but you can feel the disorientation. But what that actually is the correct order of things for Uranian type awareness. The body knows first, the mind catches up later. So you need to use discernment here because Uranus can also amplify anxiety, overstimulation, amp up your nervous system alongside genuine downloads. So not everything that arrives fast and urgent is part of it. Not every collective panic that circulates deserves access to your nervous system, if you will. But it's something you can tell the difference between something that invokes instantaneous fear in you and instantaneous insight. So discernment may be one of the most important spiritual practices of this entire era, actually. And the ability to distinguish between genuine inner knowing and fear-driven reactivity, between authentic disruption and collective contagion, between something that is genuinely asking to change and something that's simply uncomfortable and the way growth always is. So then we also have the Mars-Chiron conjunction happening. This is the final activation of this particular conjunction in Aries, and it's happening, during this lunation cycle. And Mars Chiron in Aries has long been a sometimes exhausting process of excavating wounds around action, self-trust, initiation, visibility. Chiron in Aries is about the wounded self to places where simply fully being yourself feels maybe a little dangerous, where instinctive action has gotten shut down or shamed at some point. And it's going to put a little bit of a spotlight on something that maybe you thought you had already handled. And anything that is coming up for you around visibility, or anything that sort of blocks you from being your really true, authentic self, that self that's trying to rise up and reach the sunlight through all the muck and get some air, that if you have anything around that, this Mars-Chiron activation is probably going to put a spotlight on that. And the final activation usually feels like a wrecking point, like a reckoning point. And that's not in a punishing way. It's just the way thresholds are, an opportunity to see clearly what you've been doing and to make a different choice if you need to. And gate 8 alongside this is creating that convergence point where the question of authentic expression is rather unavoidable. The cosmos has essentially arranged itself to hold up a mirror, and what you see in it matters. So now this brings us to Algol. Now, Algol has a very dramatic reputation. It's, like I said, it's sometimes called the demon star. It's associated with the head of Medusa, and traditionally has been treated as a malefic, as a dangerous, as a placement to fear. And I want to take that in a different direction, because I think that fear-based interpretation of Algol actually misses the point of it. You know, Medusa was not originally monstrous. If you go back to the older layers of the myth, before the versions that fully solidified in classical Greek literature, Medusa was a very powerful woman, a priestess, a figure of considerable power. What happened to her was a violation, specifically by Poseidon in Athena's temple. And then further violation or betrayal, one could say, when Athena, instead of offering justice, transformed her into something horrifying, something that would eventually be killed by Perseus, who would be celebrated for destroying. And that's something that society decided that it could not integrate, and so it instead exiled and demonized. So when Algol is activated chart or a lunation, it's really pointing, I feel like, just from an archetypal standpoint, it's pointing to something like the exiled self, the parts of you that became quote unquote too much at some point. It's very similar. It is a little similar to Black Moon Lilith placement. It's a too emotional, too intuitive, too sensual, too angry, too truthful, too strange, too alive, that make other people uncomfortable, and also maybe even yourself a little uncomfortable. The parts that got pushed underground because they threatened something. So exile parts don't disappear. They go underground. They become the thing you manage, the thing that you strategically keep off the surface, the thing that leaks out sideways in ways you don't understand. And under a lunation that conjuncts this, and when we talk about fixed stars, normally a conjunction is like a 3-degree orb. Fixed stars, it's generally considered like 1.5 degrees. That's it. So this is interesting that this particular conjunction is happening with all this other cosmic mix. These parts that are underground may feel like they're pressing against the surface with an unusual level of force. So what I want you to think about this is that confronting the exiled self is not the same as being destroyed by it. Perseus thought he was killing a monster, but what he was actually doing was perpetuating the same exiling dynamic that created the monster in the first place. The real healing move here is different. It's a willingness to look at what you've been taught to fear in yourself without turning it to stone, without flinching away, without managing it back underground, and to recognize it as something that belongs to you, something that has been carrying energy that you actually need. Projection is a major theme with Algol. It it activates projection in both directions. What you project out onto others, the qualities that you can't yet integrate into yourself, the shadow material that you've exiled so thoroughly that you no longer recognize it as yours, and what others project onto you, particularly if you've got projection profiles in your human design. The qualities can feel threatening or destabilizing. Then they're things that need you to carry because they can't yet hold them. That's the projections from other people. So pay attention over this lunation cycle to unusually charged emotional reactions, fascination, like the good and the bad, the fascination, the resentment, the jealousy, irritation, sudden intense admiration, all of that, because projection carries information. What we condemn most fiercely tends to point towards shadow material we have not fully integrated. What we obsessively admire tends to point towards some unlived brilliance that is actually being asked. It's actually asking to be expressed rather than, let's just say, externally worshipped. And this is the deeper work. This is not like one night's work. This is an entire cycle. So I want to pause here for just a second and talk about the lunation cycle. The lunation cycle, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I think it's worth remembering again. A lunation cycle is a living process that unfolds over approximately 29 and a half days. Every phase of that cycle has its own energetic quality, its own invitation, its own a way of working with what was seeded at the beginning. The new moon is the seeding point. It's the moment between when the sun and the moon are conjunct, and they're like in this ancient world of what was often described as fertilization. It's the planting of intention to the dark and to the invisible and to the not yet visible world, the seed being in the ground. So the seeds you plant right now aren't immediately above the surface. They're underground, they're germinating, they're gathering energy. And then the moon begins to wax, moving through crescent first quarter and gibbous phases over the next 2 weeks. And that's an active building energy. That's where the themes of the new moon start to reveal themselves through lived experience, through conversations that crack something open, through synchronicities that point in a clear direction. And then we arrive at the full moon, for which this lunation cycle falls later in the month. And I'll talk about more about that. I think it's on the 31st. And then after the full moon is the waning cycle. And this is where I feel like this is an undervalued part of the lunation process in modern practice. So the waning moon is for integration, reflection, discernment, composting. It's for releasing what didn't serve the seed that was planted. It's digesting the illumination that the full moon brought, and it completes at the next moon when the cycle begins again. So when I say this new moon is initiating something, I think it's a beginning a conversation, a living, unfolding conversation that the themes will develop over the next month. And honestly, with Uranian energy involved, probably will have a ripple effect beyond that. This is not a one-night event. It's an initiation into a process and how you participate in that process, whether you continue to show up for it when the initial activation fades. That's where you really see the fruit bearing rather than, oh, I'm just going to do this for one night. So I'm going to give you 3 things to watch for over this lunation cycle. And the first one is projection dynamics being impossible to ignore, with Algol activated along Uranus and the nodes and Mars-Chiron. All of this, the things we have been managing around the edge of our awareness are going to start finding their way to the center, whether we invite them or not. So pay a close attention to any unusually charged emotional reactions over the next month. Like I said, fascination, resentment, all the things. That's carrying information. And let's talk a little bit something about specific around the difference between processing projection and weaponizing the concept of projection, because I think the spiritual world sometimes does this. It turns that's projection into a way of dismissing other people's legitimate responses to our behavior. And what I'm describing is not that. I'm describing the genuine inner work of asking yourself with real honesty, what is mine here? And what did I bring to the situation? And what is this reaction revealing about something that I've not fully integrated in myself? The second thing to watch for is sudden nervous system clarity arriving before your logical mind catches up. This is a hallmark of Uranian energy. It's likely to be amplified over this lunation, given how active Uranus is in this chart. You might find yourself suddenly knowing something that you can't fully explain, a recognition that something no longer fits, clarity about something that's been buried for years under strategic self-management. Taurus asks you to trust what the body already knows rather than force yourself back into premature certainty through analysis. If your body is signaling something clearly, that signal deserves your attention, even before you can rationalize it into something explainable. It's not an invitation to make impulsive decisions. It's an invitation to receive the knowing and let it settle before having to do something with it. And the third thing to watch for is grief, because grief can accompany authentic expression. And I wanted to be specific about this because I don't think enough people in the spiritual spaces really name that fully. Becoming fully yourself is not always a triumphant experience. It often has a grief experience within it because authenticity tends to disrupt structures and relationships and coping mechanisms and identities that you've built a version of yourself around. And that was perhaps more managed, more edited, more strategically shaped for survival, as I said before. And when those structures shift, even when the shift is ultimately towards something more true, more alive, more fully expressed, there can be a real loss involved. And there can be mourning for that version of you that you were. And there can be grief for relationships that no longer hold because of who you're becoming. And there can be sorrow for a time spent in a very small container. And so if what you encounter over this lunation cycle carries some grief along the activation, that's not a sign that something is wrong. That's probably a sign that something real is happening. So as you move through this new moon cycle and into the initiatory terrain that this convergence of energies is creating, I will leave you with the question that feels most alive to me right now. If you stopped shaping your life around who you thought you had to be in order to be safe, to be loved, to be accepted, what would naturally want to emerge? Because that's the real seed that's being planted here. I call this lunation like the new moon of self-trust, because this is really what it is. It's a choice point. And what it comes back to is to return to what's real in you, even when it's inconvenient, and even when it's uncomfortable, and even after the fire cools out. So thank you for being here and spending the time with me. And if this resonated, please share it out with someone who might be standing at their own threshold right now. And all the information about working together is in the show notes if you need some assistance moving through this season of life. And until next time, remember to find beauty every day and seek the magic in the mundane.
thanks for tuning in today. As always, take what resonates, leave the rest. Let whatever landed move through you in whatever way it needs to or wants to. And also, if you want to explore more, you'll find more information in the show notes. If this episode stirred something in you, please share it out or leave a quick review. It helps so much and I really appreciate it. And remember, this work is about integration and it always starts with self-trust.